right. Did you have a lunch?
Yep, that was tasty.
What would you have for lunch?
Oh, chili and peppers and onions and chicken.
Oh, that sounds good.
Aurora 911, where's your emergency? I can't hear you. What address? Aurora, Colorado. Yes, I can't hear you. Give me the address again. There's gunshot. What address? Say it loud.
15 and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters, 14300 East Alameda Avenue. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium. 315 and 314, there is at least one person that's been shot, but they're saying there's hundreds of people just running around. So they're saying it happened Theater 9 where Batman was playing, but another RP is saying they're still shooting.
316, I need a rescue in here, hot. We got a guy shot.
Team 6, we got another person outside shot in the leg of female. I got people running out of the theater, they're shot in room 9.
Get us some damn gas masks for Theater 9. We can't get in it. 16, I got 7 down in Theater 9. 7 down. I've got a child victim. I need rescue at the back door of Theater 9 now. Inside of the theater is secure. We're bringing out bodies now. Get someone to the back as soon as you can. Rescue personnel. I got at least 3 to 7 hits.
I'm 9 News reporter Brandon Ritteman on the scene of breaking news in Aurora right now. A late night, apparently multiple shooting incident at a movie theater in Aurora. I'm going to step out of the shot so that we can show you exactly where we are. We are on the northeast side of the Century 16 theaters, which are in the town center of Aurora.
Then I raised the shotgun and saw that people were getting up in the back left corner, so I shot up that direction.
July 2012, 24-year-old James Holmes would walk into the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. He was attending the 12 a.m. premiere screening of the newest Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises. Roughly 20 minutes into the movie, James would fake a phone call and make his way to the emergency exit to his right. As he leaves, he uses a picnic table cloth clip to keep the door just slightly open, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Once outside, he walked over to his parked car, geared himself up head to toe in ballistic armour and a gas mask, whilst at the same time equipping himself with a Remington 870 shotgun, an AR-15, and a Glock pistol. Approximately 10 minutes later, James would walk back through that same emergency exit and, like fish in a barrel, would open fire on around 400 moviegoers, killing 12 of them and injuring 70. How did we get here? A shooter with no criminal record, had no ties to any terror organizations, wasn't known to any law enforcement agencies, but was able to carry out a massacre that no one in recent American history had ever seen before. Let's rewind back to the 13th of December 1987, where James Egan Holmes is born to parents Robert and Arlene. He grew up in Oak Hills, Monterey County in California, along with his sister, and was said to have had a fairly decent upbringing in a good neighborhood. Throughout his early years, he was described as a well-mannered, smart and shy kid, but was fairly outgoing, being one of the 15 boys who played for his local football team with his dad as the coach. Family life at home was good as well. Both siblings had parents who supported them in every aspect of their lives, and James and his sister Chrissy were said to have had a close bond with each other. James's mother would even go on to say that it was a childhood to envy. Whilst attending middle school, now aged 11, James's mental health would begin to deteriorate. He would start to exhibit signs of chronic depression and even attempted to commit suicide. He would claim to see shadowy figures which he called nail ghosts, accompanied by flickers in the corner of his eyes. These shadowy figures would hammer on the walls at night, and would fight each other with firearms and various other weapons. But it is believed that James would have homicidal thoughts from the young age of 10 years old, where he would picture himself killing people who annoyed him or upset him. He would later on picture killing people who did nothing to him at all. The mental decline would further when a house relocation was made 400 miles away to San Diego. James recalls welling up as the car pulled away from what had been a somewhat happy life with many young friends. And it's believed on that car journey he would attempt to cut his wrists with a piece of cardboard. When he arrived in San Diego, he had trouble making friends and began to withdraw into his room where he'd spend most of his days playing video games. His mum would quite literally go door to door to look for playmates, but the boys in their new neighborhood weren't exactly the friendliest. After spending all of his time indoors now when not at school, he would go on to become one of the top 5 players in the world at the video game Warcraft 3. Although making this achievement, James's mother recalls around this time that he had lost his joy and felt guilty that no matter what she did, she couldn't make him happy anymore. Looking back, she chalked this behaviour up to a tough adjustment, but she goes on to say, realistically, it was the early signs of his mental illness, because although we've been over how James's mental health had started to deteriorate from a young age, this was all behind closed doors, and his parents were none the wiser to the breakdown of his mental health. Even though he had been reserved in his social life, James was still an exceptional student going on to achieve good grades throughout middle school, and he was even involved in trumpet classes and ran cross country. This behavioural pattern would continue throughout high school. A special education teacher and coach of the Westview High School cross country team would be quoted as saying this about James: he was not particularly a good runner and he lacked proper form and stamina, but he always showed up to practice. He rarely spoke, however declined to take part in team building activities. Continuing, he was a part of us, but not a part of us. He was kind of like a shadow figure. In 2006, James graduated from high school, and seeing as both his father had degrees in mathematics and science, and his mother was a registered nurse, James wanted to follow a similar career path, so he decided that he wanted to study neuroscience at UC Riverside in California. Before the course had started, he wanted to have a taste of what it was like in that line of work, so in the summer he attended a prestigious 8-week-long internship at Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California.
Thanks, Claire. All right, our next speaker is James Holmes. He has what school did you graduate from?
Westview High School?
He just graduated from Westview High School and will be attending the University of California, Riverside. He will be majoring in neuroscience. His goals are to become a researcher and to make scientific discoveries. It's a good start. In personal life, he enjoys playing soccer and strategy games, and his dream is to own a Slurpee machine. These kids have been fun to work with this summer.
Test.
He won't let you show unless you can hear.
Really? Oh, okay. Well, the lab I work in is the Computational Neurobiology Lab, or CNL for short. CNL is very computer-oriented. Basically, everybody who works in CNL does programming of some sort. One division of the lab called MCell does mathematical models of the cell, such as that picture there. There's also computer simulations of hippocampal functions and neural network firings. And the knowledge that's gained is then made available to the public and the scientific community through the web. My mentor, John Jacobson, who works in CNL, is a philosophical type of guy. He's interested in how we perceive reality, specifically grapheme perception. And graphemes are basically just letters of the alphabet. And he wants to know how graphemes are mediated in spatial frequency channels. He also studies subjective experience, which is what takes place inside the mind, as opposed to the external world. I've carried on his work in dealing with subjective experience. And I've done it through Flash programming. Flash is set up to make movies. There's a timeline, which is on the top there. And within the timeline, there are layers, and layers give the movie order and structure. And within the layers, there are frames, and text, images, and code can be placed in the frames to make the movie do things. And my main task was to write code. And I was writing code to show how our perception of causality can be tricked. And a major way humans learn is through action and effect relationships. And to simulate this on a computer, we have a key press as an action, and the effect is the appearance of an image. And actions and effects have logical progressions through time. That is, effects proceed or seem simultaneous with the actions that cause them, unless we have a temporal order judgment reversal, which I just call the illusion. And in the illusion, the effect seems to precede the action that it causes. So subjectively, you're causing events to happen in the past. And to implement this illusion, we insert a series of gradual delays in between the actions and the effects. So we'd have a key press, and then a 10 millisecond delay, and then an image appearing, and then a key press, and then 20 millisecond, and then an image appears. And we keep doing this over and over again. And it would increase up to around 200 milliseconds. And we do this gradual delay incrementations to adapt the person to modify their perception of time. And then after we modify their perception of time, we completely remove the delay, and this causes the time illusion. And potential applications for this illusion are in reducing car accidents. And it might be possible to increase the reaction times of drivers. Also, another application is in the entertainment industry, like video games. And my mentor came up with the video game one, not me. So gamers might feel like they have a superpower, and that might let them have more fun. So lastly, I'd like to thank John, CNL, Sloan Center, Homesteaders, and family. If they want to give me an allowance bonus, that's good too. Any questions? Nope. Oh, you're spinning.
When this footage started to do the rounds in the years that followed, people claimed that this behaviour didn't match that of a socially awkward person who has serious mental health issues. Well, John Jacobson, supervisor of the lab, said that throughout his time he was there, he tried to sit down for lunch with James at least half a dozen times and tried to make conversation with him, but found it impossible because he was extremely shy. He also described James as an unusually bad intern. Jacobson said he repeatedly tried to explain to James exactly how to do the computer programming he had tasked him with, but he kept on insisting on a different approach, one that didn't work. James had been given a project on this 8-week internship and he never completed it. After the internship had ended, John had emailed James to ask if he wanted to try and complete the project, but he never got a response. Either way, James would finish the internship and attended UC Riverside, where he studied neuroscience, and in 2010 he received his undergraduate bachelor's degree with highest honours, but ended up skipping his graduation ceremony, more than likely due to his social anxiety. After graduation, he applied to 6 top graduate schools to study for a doctorate in neuroscience. Although academically bright, his shyness in interviews appeared to work against him, and so he would go on to be rejected by all 6 universities. In 2010, after his dreams of going on to further study in his field had collapsed, he decided to move back home with his parents and seemingly had no purpose in life. He sleeps, eats, and plays video games all day, going back to his old ways, but now as an adult, he's pushed by his parents to go and get a job. He secured himself a job at a pill coating factory where he works from around 4 PM till 2 PM every day, Monday till Sunday. He was offered full-time placement, but in his own words, he couldn't see himself doing that line of work for the rest of his life. During this time, his parents continued to push him to apply for graduate schools, which he did. Iowa, Illinois, and Colorado all offered him interviews, but he still presented poorly. He was described as being aloof, quiet. They perceive him to be disinterested, not a good fit for the program. In fact, some people who interviewed him would go on to say, quote, "Do not take this guy under any circumstances." Even though he didn't seem like a good fit, Illinois and Colorado offered him a placement, with him accepting the latter as they offered him more financial aid. And so it seemed as if James had his purpose back once again. He got into the competitive neuroscience program where only 6 students per year get accepted. The program consists of 2 things: The first would be classes in the fall and spring, just like any other course, but the other half is something called a lab rotation. You get 3 in 1 year, and this basically consists of a research project under the supervision of a faculty trainer, but if for whatever reason you don't get accepted into one after a somewhat trial period, then you get kicked off the program. All 3 would end up going badly for James, and when the time came to choose a lab, he decided to go with the first professor. He was described in his evaluation as having a lack of communication skills and again showing a lack of interest, something that a student would need moving forward, so he was declined on that basis. During the first and second lab rotations, he started to see a girl, but only a short while after the second lab rotation, they would go on to break up. After the deterioration of his performance and the breakup with his girlfriend, James decided to see the university counsellor. When he met the counsellor, she asked him if he was suicidal, to which he denied, but he did tell her he was having homicidal thoughts. The counsellor would go on to say this wasn't a concern, as many students had came to her before with homicidal ideations, and because James stated he had no specific targets, he had no plans, no delusions, and no hallucinations in regards to these homicidal ideations, the counsellor concluded that he wasn't a threat. He was eventually passed on to the university psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Fenton. Similar things were reported, but when Dr. Fenton pressed him about the homicidal comments that he made, he responded, quote, "People are my problem, and the only solution is to kill everyone, but that can't happen because it isn't realistic." She concluded that he might have OCD, so she gives him some medication, and adds he doesn't pose a threat because he denied he self-mutilates, doesn't plan on committing suicide, and doesn't plan on killing anyone. That was all to save face though, because deep down inside of James Holmes, he had something cooking up that would fruition in the months that followed. You see, although he'd been telling Dr. Fenton he basically didn't pose a threat, in his journal, it painted a whole different side of him. And if anyone would have known what was in this journal, I probably wouldn't be making this video right now. In his journal, he's quoted as saying he can't tell the therapists, who he called mind rapists, his plans, because if he did, his normal life would combine with his ideal enactment of working on his homicidal ideations, and his plans would end up foiling. He said he would continue to have his guard up and deflect any incriminating questions. If they asked if he had a plan, he would continue to deny them, because if he did go on to spill the beans, they would have him locked up and he wouldn't be able to go on and kill people. Around this time, he's emailing back and forth with his ex-girlfriend. You see, the two had kept in contact and were somewhat okay as friends. In this email, James would talk to her about his future prospects fading away and having a desire to kill people. She thought the latter was theoretical based on other conversations they've had in the past, so she engages in the conversation. For example, she says that killing people is too much effort and that he'd get thrown in jail for it. He responds, "That's why you'd kill many people, and if you wait until the end of your life, there's nothing to lose." The conversation goes on for a while, but then the value of life becomes the focal point. James would go on to say, quote, "There's nothing more valuable than a human life. You take away the life of a person, you take away the experiences of that person, and you take away all of their potential." His ex would prod him to open up about what he exactly meant, to which he responds, "It's human capital." Again, when questioned what he's going to do with all that human capital from having taken away all of those people's lives, he responds, "Have a more meaningful life." But the thing is, James doesn't even know what that means to himself. All he can explain is that it's just what he wants to do. His ex would go on to explain it wouldn't fulfill his purpose, but he believes it will grant him a more meaningful life. By the time April of 2012 comes around, James decided to nip things in the bud with his ex-girlfriend, saying he just simply can't be friends with her anymore, and the two part ways. Around 2 weeks later, he's back to see Dr. Fenton once again, still sticking to his plan, keeping a guard up, and he denies having any suicidal thoughts and outright refuses to talk about any homicidal thoughts. But once again, Dr. Fenton sends him on his way, saying he poses no threat. The following month in May, James continued to perform great in his exams, not so great in that third lab rotation, and because of this he felt like once again his purpose in life was slipping away because of his bad performances at university, so he decided he would find himself a new purpose in life. In his journal he begins to hatch a plan on how he could kill people to make himself feel better. His failed performance at school, he notes, would act as the somewhat catalyst for the motivation behind the killings. In this plan, his first thoughts were bombs, but he reckons they'll be way too suspicious. Later, he thought about biological warfare, but scraps the idea because it requires too much knowledge and chemical use. He ponders on serial murder heavily. His plan would be buy a stun gun shaped like a phone, equip himself with a folding knife, head over to national park forest trails, and one by one pick off his victims. But no, it's way too personal. It would be easy to get caught, it leaves too much evidence, and most of all, it's not enough kills. So his last resort would be mass murder, and then the light bulb switched on. Maximum casualties and can be performed easily with firearms, which would also mean it was less personal. He does note that there's a 99% chance of being caught, but he didn't mind because he said he didn't fear the consequence. Now that his type of attack is planned out, it was time to choose the location. He thought about an airport but quickly aborted the idea due to the heavy security presence, and it'd be too linked to terrorism. You see, he didn't want people concluding this act of mass murder was based on terrorism because that wasn't his message. The message was, he said, there was no message. He eventually chose the Century 16 movie theater based roughly 4 miles from his apartment in Aurora, Colorado. It's the perfect location in his mind. It's proximal to where he lives, it's isolated, it's large, so what a better place to case and plan for mass murder than an inconspicuous entertainment facility. He started to map out the theater in detail both outside and in, and he began assessing the different theatre rooms, talking about the best approach and quickly criticising the ones that have too many exits. Theatre 9 and 10 became primary targets because in both theatres there's only one entrance and 2 exits. He noted that you can lock some of the theatre room doors with handcuffs, which equaled the maximum number of casualties. He would also do in-depth research about the Columbine massacre that happened years prior to see what the police response time would be and how much ammo he would need. The police response time would roughly be 3 minutes, and so he had to do something about that. Just bear that one in mind though, because it will become more relevant as the story continues. Throughout May, James would go on to buy various items that he would eventually use for the shooting, such as a Glock pistol, a shotgun, a gas mask, and tear gas. Then towards the end of the month, he continued to see Dr. Fenton, but this time she brought in Dr. Robert Feinstein, a specialist in violence and suicide assessment. Dr. Feinstein would take charge of this meeting to see if he could grasp what was going on with James. Ultimately, James was able to pull the wool over his eyes as well, because after denying having any targets, any suicidal thoughts, and agreeing to come back for more counselling, he's let go once again, and they know that he's showing signs of stability, hence why he's able to leave. At the start of June, James takes his preliminary exams, but fails them. Of course, around this time he had also not been chosen to do a lab rotation, so he feels like quitting. He goes to see Dr. Fenton again, where he tells her he's going to quit the program to find a job in Aurora for the next few months because the lease on his apartment didn't end until November. She quizzed him on various things such as student debt to see if this would affect his mental health moving forward, but he didn't have any. In fact, he had around $10,000 in the bank. Dr. Fenton would ask James to continue to come back and see her even if he quit the program, to which he would go on to say that his insurance wouldn't cover it, and then he got up and left. That was the last time he would see Dr. Fenton. She would go on to call family members and program leaders to ask them about how James was, and although they claimed he was odd and had social problems, they agreed on one thing, and that was he wasn't a violent individual. But of course they'd be proven wrong. So James decided to leave the course, and throughout June he continued to gear up in order to act out on his plan, now only having one purpose in life. He bought an AR-15, laser sights, tens of magazines for his guns, a case for his rifle, a bullet blocker jacket, a helmet, tire puncturing devices, first aid dressing, and quite literally thousands of rounds of ammunition. In July, he continues his shopping spree, buying ballistic trousers, rifle scopes, more ammunition, neck protection, arm protection, groin protection, and purchases a second handgun. He would also acquire Bluetooth headphones and an iPod, as he didn't want to make the shooting feel personal, so he'd pop the headphones in so he could shoot people and not hear them scream. He decided to dye his hair red, not to match that of the Joker like many people believe, rather to stand out, where he later would explain it was exotic and it would look better than green or blue. Now remember how I said that he needed to do something about the quick police response time? Well, to combat this, on the 18th of July 2012, he booby-trapped his apartment building with various chemicals and flammables. The bomb itself was hooked up to some sort of wire that if the door opened, it would blow up. Attached to the bomb were 3 jars filled up with bullets, gunpowder and napalm. There was also broken magnesium on the floor. You see, magnesium fires are made worse by water. If water comes into contact with it, it lets off a lethal hydrogen gas, so if anyone wanted to try and put the fire out, they'd be making it 10 times worse. But how could he lure someone to set off the bomb? Well, there was 2 ways that this thing could be set off. First, an RC car was placed by some bins near his apartment building. He put a boombox by the car which would be silent for 40 minutes, and then that would be followed by loud music. On top of the RC car was a remote, but the remote wasn't for the car or the boombox, it was for the detonation system in the apartment. So in turn, a random person would walk up to this boombox, car and remote, trying to maybe turn it off. They might use the remote, but they've just blown the building up. The next way, which James was banking on, was inside the apartment itself. Again, he set his computer to play loud music around 20 to 25 minutes after he left the building. This in turn would summon people to open the door and then blow the building up. This nearly worked, but ultimately failed after a neighbour was awoken by the music and pounded on James's door to no response. She even touched the door handle and realised it was open, but for whatever reason she decided to go back to her apartment and call for the police. The only thing is though, all the police were heading to the Century 16 Theatre to reports of an active shooter, and on a quick side note, the explosives would eventually be safely removed by the bomb squad and there would be no reported casualties in regards to the apartment block. Rewinding the clock ever so slightly, and James Holmes would leave his booby-trapped apartment to head for the Century 16 movie theatre. He took a Vicodin because he feared he might get shot and the medication would make it less painful. Once arriving at the theatre, he parks around the back just outside of Theatre 9, then walks around to the entrance where he picks up his ticket from a kiosk desk. He hands it to the attendant and makes his way to the concession stand. He loiters briefly but eventually would make his way to Theatre 9, although his ticket had been for Theatre 8.
So you go in the theater, what's it like? What are you seeing and hearing as you go in the theater?
I just went to the very front and sat down in one of the chairs and then pulled out my phone to make it look like I had a phone call.
I'm sorry?
Pulled out my phone to make it look like I had a phone call.
Okay.
And then went out the exit for that reason.
What else did you see in the theater when you first went in?
Well, it's just an aisleway.
I'm sorry?
It's just an aisleway to the stands. And I looked back in the stands and saw that they were all full.
Okay. So you go out through some sort of exit corridor to the outside exit door, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then what happened?
Then I went to put the stuff on and get all the weapons ready.
Any particular thoughts, preparations, getting ready, psyching yourself up, anything like that?
I put my music on my headphones, on my wireless headphones.
Okay. Then what happened?
Then an employee came out to the dumpster and threw something away, but I had the tinted windows and the sun shade up, so they didn't see me.
I heard them and everything.
But
I heard them.
You heard them come out?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you think about when they came out?
If they're going to interrupt the process or not. But they didn't. They just went back inside the theater after they threw the trash away.
If they had somehow interrupted the process, what would have happened?
I had a handgun in my passenger door side that I could have used.
Okay. Were you prepared to do that if necessary?
Yeah.
At what point did you call the behavioral health hotline or the hotline of some kind?
Like halfway through gearing up.
From the car then?
Yeah.
Okay. So that was something that happened in the car. If you can, I'd like to pretty much hear everything. I want to hear the whole
I
story.
called them, but I couldn't hear anybody on the other line.
What led you to make that call?
Just one last chance to see if I should turn back or not.
As far as you know, your reception was fine in the middle of town.
Right.
And you didn't hear any answer, electronic or personal or otherwise, on the other end?
No.
And you said 9 seconds. Did you kind of count them off, or did you show on the phone how long it was?
It said like call ended after 9 seconds.
I'm sorry?
It said call ended after 9 seconds.
Do you remember what you thought or felt or when nobody answered?
Then shortly after, I thought the FBI would stop me.
Walk me through. You go in through the outer door, then what happens, and what do you see, what do you hear, what do you smell?
First, I opened the tear gas canister while I was still outside the door, and it made a hissing sound. And then I went inside and tossed it over on the right side of the theater.
How did it feel to be really doing it?
Then it was autopilot.
Walk me through from there.
Then I raised the shotgun and saw that people were getting up in like the back left corner. So I like shot up that direction, and then I don't remember any of the other shots of the shotgun.
Any idea why those people were getting up in the back left corner?
Well, they could see me all decked out with my guns and stuff.
Okay. So you shot in that direction. Do you know whether you hit anything?
I heard a scream.
You heard
So
a
I
scream?
assumed, yeah.
You shot how many times toward the folks in the upper left?
I think the shotgun held 5 or 6 shells. So I shot all 6 of them.
Emptied in that direction, okay.
But then I threw the gun down and switched to the AR-15, and I don't remember where I shot those ones either, except for like 2 people who tried to run away, and I shot like 3 shots at them.
There were many more people in the theater than the 2 who were trying to run away.
Right.
Did their running away prompt you to shoot them?
It made me kind of focus on them or divert my attention to them.
While you were firing, did anybody get out while you were firing?
Yeah, the 2 people who ran away, and then afterwards, 4 people, I think, carried a guy out, and they got out the back exit, the emergency exit. I had a scope on it, but I didn't use it to sight. I just shot randomly.
In the direction of people, but randomly would have...
Randomly towards the people.
Okay. At least some of the time you were trying to shoot specific people.
Right, so those 2 people who ran were the specific people. And then there was one other guy, which they carried out, who was a specific person I shot at.
How about the sound? What did all that sound like?
Well, I'd had my music in to drown out sounds, and I guess I didn't hear much.
How high was the music turned up?
To its full volume.
Full volume.
I'm basically in that corner the whole time, except for once I go into the light, which is later.
Okay.
The lighted hallway. I was checking the weapon, and I discharged the magazine that had misfired. I was trying to put a new one in, but they wouldn't go inside they wouldn't click in there.
Okay. So what was your purpose of walking up that out?
To be able to see, because I couldn't see very well in the corner. And it was a safer spot to reload. Then I walked out. I think before I went into the aisleway, I shot some with the handgun, but I don't remember shooting the handgun.
Before you went into the aisleway? Okay.
Yeah.
Did you walk up the aisles at all and look down the aisles to see if there was anybody behind seats or anything like that?
No, I didn't walk up into the stands.
Okay.
Bullets, blood, brains and bodies is how the prosecution described the horrific scene that James Holmes left behind. In that short period of time, he opened fire on around 400 moviegoers, killing 12, the youngest 6-year-old Veronica Sullivan, and a further 70 were injured. But words just simply can't describe the mayhem that was rained upon those innocent people that day. From the details we know, bullets flew across the theatre, hitting multiple people in their heads and bodies as they ran for safety and ducked for cover behind chairs. James would later say he specifically aimed for people who were escaping to deter more from doing so. Some of the victims had acted as human shields in order to protect their loved ones. This worked, but unfortunately they wouldn't make it out alive on the 20th of July 2012. Bullets even penetrated through the walls, which in turn meant they went through to Theatre 8. Some had been shot in the face, but they would go on to survive.
Good evening, thanks for joining us. We'll take you back to the vigil that will soon start in just a moment, but first, the intense manhunt for the person responsible for the chaos at the Eaton Center last night when he opened fire in the crowded mall.
1 month prior to the shooting, on the 2nd of June 2012, several people were shot, resulting in 2 deaths when a gunman opened up in the food court of the Eaton Center in Toronto, Canada. In attendance was aspiring sports reporter Jessica Gowie, who had reported on the incident live on her Twitter feed. Towards the end of the coverage, she tweeted an eerie tweet which read, "A man dressed as Batman is charging tourists to take pictures outside the Eaton Center yelling, 'My parents are dead.' Very tacky and heartless." After surviving a mass shooting, she would be caught up in another one 1 month later, and this time she wouldn't be as lucky. "Never thought I'd have to coerce a guy into seeing the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises with me," she tweets, followed by, "Of course we're seeing Dark Knight. Red-headed Texan Spitfire. People should never argue with me. Maybe I should get in on those NHL talks." Minutes later, she would be brutally murdered in that Century 16 movie theatre by none other than James Holmes. The shotgun had been used first and all rounds were fired into the crowd. Next was the AR-15, but 65 rounds in, it jammed on him. James would make his way to the hallway to use the light to try and sort the clip out, but ultimately he failed to do so. He ended off by using his .40 caliber Glock pistol. He fired 5 rounds, but after making his way back through that emergency exit, he would soon be apprehended by officers after they spotted him standing by his car. Believe it or not, they had made it to the theatre in under 2 minutes, quicker than his prediction of 3.
Could we get your name?
I already gave my name.
Okay, I haven't talked to anybody who has your name. If you could just tell us what your name is.
It's James.
James, okay.
Holmes.
James what?
Holmes.
Holmes? How do you spell that, please?
Like Sherlock.
Okay, so Holmes?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to read this to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Okay?
The sign said Victim Services Unit, Children's something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, yeah. What about that?
There wasn't any children hurt, was it?
I don't know. We'll get to that. I don't know.
Multiple moviegoers were in critical condition, but there was a slight issue. There were no ambulances. You see, the ambulances were blocked behind parked cars, police vehicles, and the thousands of people who had just fled the theatre. So at this point, officers took the initiative to put multiple people in their cars and drove them to 5 nearby hospitals, and this in turn would save multiple lives. After all the seriously injured victims were taken by police, it allowed for ambulances to eventually come through, and the people who were less injured were then taken to hospital via ambulance. Of the 60 patients who were brought to hospitals, 27 went in police cars and 20 went in ambulances. Others were transported in private vehicles and 1 walked. There had also been reports that there were 2 shooters rather than 1. Various witnesses had came out to tell reporters that a man had let another person in after going towards the exit. But with all the chaos and confusion, you could see as to why people would think that. For example, one woman would go on to say,
the alarm go off, it said murder in the theater. Like, it's just going off, murder in the theater, murder in the theater. It's crazy that they got an alarm saying that there was a murder in the theater, you know?
But the alarm really said emergency in the theatre. So it just goes to show you that sometimes in a state of panic, you might think you've seen or heard something, but that might not necessarily be true. Eventually though, James Holmes would go on to be charged with quite literally hundreds of counts. He was hit with 2 counts of first-degree murder for each of the victims he fatally shot, and then 2 counts of attempted murder for each of the 70 others who were injured but survived. He'd also got some charges for the booby-trapped apartment. He would go on to admit that yes, it was him who was the shooter that day, but he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution wouldn't accept the plea, and so a trial went ahead in April of 2015. After months of witness testimony, evidence being presented to the court, and the cases of why James Holmes was either sane or insane, the jury would find him guilty on all counts, but it was now up to them to decide whether he should get the death penalty or not. Eventually, the jury failed to make a unanimous decision, and so the death sentence was thrown out, and all that was left now was the judge going on to sentence him.
Running all of the sentences consecutive and adding them all up, I believe the total comes out to 12 life sentences without the possibility of parole, consecutive to each other and consecutive to 3,312 years in the Department of Corrections. Yes, actually it's 3,318, excuse me. I realized that I have imposed the maximum sentences, and somebody yesterday said, Judge, I want to make sure that whatever sentences you impose, that you are 100% sure that they are just and fair. And I am 100% sure that these are just and fair. I want to make it clear that it is the court's intention that the defendant never set foot in free society again. The intention of my sentences is that he spend every single day of the rest of his life in prison, and that he be imprisoned without the possibility of parole. If there was ever a case that warranted the maximum sentences, this is the case. One of the victims yesterday said the defendant does not deserve any sympathy. I wholeheartedly agree. The defendant does not deserve any sympathy, and for that reason, the court imposes the maximum sentences that the court can impose under the law. Sheriff, get the defendant out of my courtroom, please. Thank you.
And so for the people of Aurora, Colorado, the 20th of July 2012 will be a summer's night they'll never forget. A time when friends and families were out just to have a good time, but ultimately would have their lives taken away with a man whose motive wasn't exactly clear. We can attempt to get into the mind of James Holmes and say that his motive was more than likely a failed path in life with no purpose. Mix that with mental health issues and you've got your answer. All the warning signs had been there in the months leading up to the shooting, and it saddens me to think that nothing was done beforehand. You see, although we mentioned throughout the video that Dr. Fenton had let him go on multiple occasions, he actually told her that he wanted to become a famous killer, as he wouldn't be able to make his mark in the science world. Dr. Fenton would go on to say that she lacked evidence to have him placed on psychiatric hold, but I think the more you look into those meetings, the more that it points towards evidence showing that he could have and he should have been put into place on a psychiatric hold. Had that been done, then maybe all of those innocent lives wouldn't have been taken away on the 20th of July, 2012.